Welcome to the show, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Before we begin today's episode, I want to say thank you to our newest supporters, Olga, Abigail, and Kirby. We truly appreciate your generosity. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can become a patron at patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Or if you prefer to make a one-time donation, please visit buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And as always, subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends is one of the best ways to show your support, and we appreciate it. Now let's get ready and start the show. Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, and thank you for being here. As always, I am your host, Nick Ryan. Today's first listener story comes to us from Aaron. Aaron's story is called A Suited Stranger. Aaron says, "Hello. I recently discovered your show, and I am hooked, so I decided to share the only experience that I've had. The year was 2010. It was the summer, and I lived in West Virginia with my father and stepmother. We lived on the outskirts of a small town. A small town here is approximately 3,000 people total. The unincorporated place that my family lived had under 100 people, and I had a friend who lived there very close from me, at a crossroads where one side of the road was agricultural fields. I had walked to my friend's house one summer afternoon. Her house was about 100 to 200 yards from this intersection, and up a slight incline, so you could see the main road and crossroad from her living room window. To my unfortunate discovery, no one was home. I hadn't bothered to text or call because it was such a short distance, so I took a seat on her back porch and looked out to the fields. There are 3 houses on her side of the road between her home and the crossroad, only one of which was inhabited. On the other side of her home was a small trail house, where the operating hours were 1 hour a day, so it was empty as well. So, I am looking at the crossroad, enjoying the quiet, the breeze, the summer, when I notice a figure. A really tall figure. A man. That's odd, I thought. What's even odder is this person or man seemed to be dressed in a suit, with a matching hat. That's weird for this area, I thought again. This person had a black briefcase and was dressed in a black and white suit, but not in the traditional sense. This suit had a diagonal stripe that went from his left ankle to his right shoulder that split the suit into 2 colors. The bottom portion was black and the top portion was white. His hat, which must have been the size of a sun hat based on the distance, did the opposite, splicing into 2 colors from right to left diagonally, the bottom portion of the hat being white and the top being black. Pure ice-cold fear ran up and down my back, and I started pouring sweat. I didn't know what I was seeing, where he came from, or how long he'd been there. He's giant, I thought to myself. Even my inner voice was shaky. Without looking away from the person at the crossroads, I whispered to myself so faintly that I could barely hear it, "Come to me." I have no idea what compelled me to say that particular phrase, but I did. And, as if I had screamed it, the person crossed the road. I stood bolt upright. I wanted to run, but my feet were cemented in that spot, on that wooden deck. There was no way that that person had heard me. I'm far away, so far that I can't see their face. How did they hear me? I begin to panic. My heart is pounding in my chest. I can't take my eyes off this person. But they're walking toward me. They're coming for me. I am in danger. I need to get out of here. I forced myself to look at my feet to see if I can move. But when I looked back up, they were gone. I had only looked away for a split second, and there was no way this person could have been hiding. I don't know what I saw. I can only really say that I saw it. Looking back now, I think I saw what I would call the time police, people who control the timeline. Telling this story makes my spine chill. Thanks for listening. Our next story of the night comes from Benjamin. Benjamin's story is called Choir of Unknown Voices. Benjamin says, "Hi, Nick. I recently found your podcast and have binged it ever since on my long drives for work. It makes being on the road for so long much more bearable. Sorry if some of the details I share seem a little random. I just want to include the main things that I feel might be related to the main experience. My parents have told me that when I was a toddler, I used to have horrible night terrors. However, I can't remember anything about them. They just say that I would scream bloody murder for a while, then wake up and run into their room to sleep with them. When I was a little older, around the age of 8 or 9, I believe, I had a very specific fear of demons. I was afraid they were always listening to me and wanted to harm me. I've been religious since I was very young, but we were never taught to live in fear of demons or anything, so I'm not sure where that fear came from. During that time in my life, something strange occurred multiple times. I'm not sure how many times or when it started or stopped. I just know that it happened fairly regularly, and then just stopped happening altogether. I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear what sounded like a church choir singing very loudly. It would fade in and out, and it sounded as if it was coming from all around me. There were never any discernible words. It just sounded like they were vocalizing, like the stereotypical angelic singing sound. Whenever I would look around the room, nothing was out of the ordinary. It would normally continue until I fell asleep. I never felt fear. It was just very strange. I know some people will say that I was just dreaming, but I remember these occurrences vividly. I've never heard anyone share a story like this, so I'm really interested to know if anyone else has ever experienced anything like this, and what it might have been. If you choose to share this story, thank you. Stay spooky, Benjamin." Our next story of the night comes from Jay. Jay's story is called La Llorona and the Black Dog. Jay says, "Hi, Nick. I am new to the podcast, but I would like to share my stories with you all. My story takes place back when I lived in Guatemala with my Nana. I was 7 or 8 years old. I had broken my right leg, and my Nana said I should sleep on the couch next to her bed, just in case I needed anything at nighttime. One night, I had the sudden urge to wake up, which I did. I looked up, and I saw a woman with long hair covering her face. As it was looking down on me, my body would not react. I was paralyzed until I closed my eyes and said, 'God, help me.' I was able to scream, and my Nana woke up frightened and turned on the light and asked if I was okay. As I answered yes to her, I looked around, and it was gone, or so I thought. My Nana turned off the light, and I still felt uneasy and scared, yet I was curious, and got on my knees on the couch, and there it was by the door, with long hair covering its face, with a white dress, staring at me. I quickly laid back down, covering myself with my blanket, and prayed, and then fell asleep. Ever since then, I have experienced sleep paralysis. I haven't seen it ever since, but I have experienced other encounters many years later. I was 23 years old, now living in America. It was Christmas Eve, and as we are Hispanic, we celebrate the 24th, Noche Buena, and everything from that night is a blur. It's like I blacked out, and I can't remember everyone or everything from that night. I remember interacting with my family, and the next thing I remember, I'm being woken up by something that jumped on me. I was sleeping on my stomach in the living room, and I felt it jumping on my back. My body was between its 4 legs. I felt it smelling my hair, and it stopped by my right ear. After sniffing me, it jumped off of me, and I peeked, thinking it was a dog that I've been seeing the day before, roaming around the neighborhood. I talked myself into peeking, and I saw a black shadow doing a circle, and then a half circle, before coming back to me to sniff me one more time. I closed my eyes and said another prayer. I then grabbed my phone and shined the light to it, and nothing was there. I froze, but I knew that I couldn't stay there. I ran to my mother's room, but it felt like I was running for hours. I opened my mom's door, crying hysterically. She woke up disoriented and asked what had happened. My sister woke up and came into my mother's bedroom to ask what was going on. I was able to calm down, and I told them both everything. They both went to check the living room and the doors, but nothing was there. A few days before, I was watching TV in the living room around 7-ish p.m. I heard the back door at first open, and then a few minutes later, the front door opened like someone opened it and was holding on to the door, and it was just staring at me. I also was staring at it, but it was too dark to see anything. I just felt it staring at me. After those events, my sleep paralysis was getting worse, until one day I prayed. I really prayed, and the sleep paralysis stopped. I haven't had any experiences since, and I like it that way. Thank you for listening to my stories, and if anyone knows what this was, I hope that you can let me know. Thank you, Nick, for giving me a way to share my experiences, and knowing that I'm not alone. All the best. Our next listener story of the night comes from Nick. Nick's story is called The Helpful Little Girl and Cavalry. Nick says, "Hello, I'm an avid listener of your podcast and have enjoyed every story you've shared. One story in particular reminded me of an experience I had had, and after much deliberation, I have decided to share it with you. I must preface this by saying that I really don't like sharing this story, as I have been ridiculed for it, but every word I'm about to tell you is exactly what happened on the night of July 12th, 2011. When I listened to the encounter that one of your listeners had with the skipping girl in the forest, I was reminded of this night. In the summer of 2011, I worked as a camp counselor for a Boy Scout camp in Colorado. When working at this camp, there was a far-off section of the forest that many staff avoided. They all would tell me stories of the little girl that haunts the forest, and many staff would show legitimate fear as they told me about her. Keep in mind that these were fully grown, 21-plus-year-old men telling about this little girl that terrified them. She was described as a young girl, around the age of 7 or 8 years old, and she always beckoned people to play with her. In fact, the head staff of the camp would tell me about how she commonly would tug on their clothes and in a childish voice say, "Come play with me." The story goes that this little girl lived with her family near the woods in the late 1800s, while the land was still claimed by the local Native American tribes. One day, the tribes killed her family and found her hiding under some wooden boards. The young girl is said to have been scalped by the indigenous people and killed. A small division of the U.S. cavalry found the remains of the girl and her family. Subsequently, the division was also killed later by the same tribe. It is said that besides the sound of the little girl, some people also hear the clopping of horse hooves and men shouting in the distance from time to time. After hearing these stories, I was very skeptical, and I just thought that the older guys were trying to scare the new guy, me. As the summer went on, I had nothing out of the ordinary happen until the night of July 12th, 2011. The only reason why I remember this day is because of this event. At around 11 o'clock at night, the tornado sirens started to sound as a tornado was spotted about 5 miles away from the camp. It rained and hailed so much that we had mounds of hail that looked like snow. Actually, it had rained and hailed so much that a 100-foot diameter lake formed overnight. Everybody hunkered down to wait out the storm, and after the tornado was far enough away, we were sent out to check and see if everyone was okay. Of course, being the new guy, they sent me to the haunted area of the woods. I had 2 other staff with me, and we laughingly joked about finding the little girl or the cavalry. As we met with 2 older adults in an open meadow, we started to talk about the damage they had incurred. It was still raining, and was very cold as we stood there talking with them. All of a sudden, the rain stopped. Now here's the weird part. The rain was still falling all around us, except right on top of us 5. It also became super warm. It was almost like we were encased in a bubble of some sort. This was extremely strange, as this was a completely open meadow, and there were no trees or rocks or anything near us or over us to deflect the downpouring rain and cold air. We were completely in the open, and the nearest trees were about 60 to 70 feet in every direction. While we were talking with them, we all started to comment on how much warmer it just got, but the rain was still falling all around us. I stretched my arm outside of this bubble, and it was instantly much colder and wetter than it was in the bubble. I brought my hand back in, and again it was instantly warmer and drier. I looked at the other 4 guys, and we all looked at each other with looks of, "Are you seeing and feeling this?" and "How is this possible?" We then left the meadow and worked our way to their camp, where a boy had been injured by falling debris and was showing signs of hypothermia. As I was moving the debris away from the boy, I felt a tug and a push, as if it were a man telling me to step aside. As I turned my head to see who this man was, I saw no one. I shook my head, thinking that the ghost stories were starting to get to me. I reached my hands under this boy and lifted him up because he couldn't walk, and to my amazement, I lifted him as if he were a small bag of flour. This boy wasn't small either. He must have been about 130 to 140 pounds, and yet he felt weightless in my arms. At that moment, I didn't think much about it, as I was more focused on getting the boy to the EMTs. But now looking back on it, I wonder if that push and tug I felt was the little girl or a member of the cavalry trying to help me get the boy to safety. There may have been another helping me to carry the boy without my knowledge. After that night was over, I spoke to the other staff who were with me, and they also reported strange occurrences that night as well, when they were helping the campers. None of us returned to that area after that night was over. I know that this isn't your typical ghost story, but I am truly perplexed by this mystery. Even today, I work as a scientist, and my job is to find explanations for strange things we find in our experiments, but yet, I have no explanation for this strange event. I get ridiculed because people call this a lame story, but when I ask them for their explanation, no one can give me an answer. Thank you for listening to my story and allowing me to share it without ridicule. Sincerely, Nick. Tonight's next story comes from Scotty. Scotty says, "Hi Nick, I have 2 stories for you. The first isn't too exciting, but still memorable to me. At my parents' house we have a game room upstairs. There's a perpendicular hallway at the top of the stairs with my bedroom to the right, my brother's bedrooms to the left, and the game room is directly across the hall from the stairs. My brothers and I would always feel uneasy in the game room, and I never liked walking by it or being in there at night. Strange things would always happen around the house, but most often it would take place in the upstairs or in the game room. Just little things like random noises, a door opening, or bathroom faucets turning on. One time my older brother was lying in bed at night, and the light to his adjoined bathroom came on. One of the only times I personally witnessed something was one afternoon when I was in high school and home alone. I was in the game room on the computer, which was situated on the opposite side of the room from the door and the stairs, and so my back was to the stairs. Anytime someone came upstairs, you would know, because the last few steps near the top would squeak. While on the computer, I heard the stairs squeak, so I turned around to see who was coming up the stairs, and as I did, I saw the figure of a man, just for a split second, standing in the middle of the game room, next to the couch, staring at me. Before I even had the time to register what I had seen, he was gone, but I saw enough to describe him as being as tall as my dad, and wearing a pink shirt and blue jeans. It happened so fast, but I can still see it today. After I had realized what I had seen, I was a little spooked, and I left the room. The second story was more terrifying. I was still at home, but this time I was in college. At the time, I was addicted to watching ghost adventures, even though I believed things like that could be a doorway for demons, but I tried to play it off as it wouldn't happen to me. However, I was asleep one night and woke up in the middle of the night lying flat on my back and felt something touching my feet. I sat up a little bit to try and see what it was, when a force pushed my shoulders back down onto the bed. As my shoulders hit the bed, my head turned to the left, and I realized something was holding my feet, and another was holding my shoulders. I never saw a shadow or any other form, but I knew something, or some things, were there. As I laid there unable to move, I heard something whisper in my right ear, saying, "Don't move." I can't remember when I closed my eyes during all of this, but when I opened them again, I was freed, lying in the same position with my head turned to the left, and everything was gone. I've never had sleep paralysis before or since this time, so I don't believe that this was the case, especially since I was able to sit up to look at my feet just before everything happened. It's possible that it could have all been a dream, but it felt too real, and I was in the same position after I opened my eyes. After that night, I stopped watching Ghost Adventures, even though I was still strongly drawn to it. Coincidentally or not, nothing else happened to me after that night. There are more stories from my parents' house, but these were the only substantial events that I witnessed myself. I love the podcast and can't get enough. Scotty. Our next story comes from Bridget. Bridget's story is called Scream in the Kitchen. Bridget says, "Hi Nick, love the show. I'll start my experience with some backstory. I was living with my mom a couple years back in a large, not-so-nice manufactured home. There were 3 bedrooms, 2 on one side, and the third, where I was staying, was all the way across the house, separated by a large living room and kitchen. My mom had been dabbling with EVPs and things of that nature for a little while, and didn't really know the proper ways to end a session. I've heard that if you don't say goodbye the right way, that things tend to stick around. Hearing footsteps in the night was a regular occurrence. My bed would shake for no apparent reason. I swear I saw a dark shadow fly across my room in the middle of the day one time as well. Things like that. Well, one night I was jolted awake by the sound of a man in our kitchen screaming, 'Move!' followed immediately by my cat screeching and hissing, and then running into my room. I laid there awake for a couple of minutes, listening, and when I heard nothing else, I just figured I had dreamt it. The next morning, I couldn't shake the experience, so I texted my mom and said, 'Did you hear someone screaming in the kitchen last night, or did I dream that?' Her response made my heart drop. She heard it at the same time, and coming from the same room that I had. She heard my cat freak out as well. I had previously saged the house due to all of the odd sounds and shadows, but I didn't know that my mom had been using the EVP the night before we had heard the screams. We saged the house again, and I told my mom not to use her equipment anymore. I've since moved out, and I don't think anything else has happened since then. Not the craziest of stories, but it really shook me and my mom." Our next story of the night comes from Chantel. Chantel says, "Hi Nick, I love your podcast. Here are my 2 stories. Several years ago, I met a guy, Frank, online. We hit it off right away. Our first date was so much fun, and I really looked forward to seeing him again. Unfortunately, he didn't feel the same, and we didn't have another date. I was pretty sad, as it's hard for me to find people that I genuinely have a good time with. Around this time, I started to get interested in spirituality. One evening, shortly after being rejected, I decided to give meditation a try. A few minutes in, I sensed a bright light over me. Then a voice popped into my head that said, 'We were protecting you from him.' I assumed this was in regards to Frank. I've always wondered what they were protecting me from." My next story takes place in 2017, when I started dating a guy named Ayez, who was originally from Bangladesh. I fell head over heels in love. One night, I had a dream that I was walking with a handsome stranger. He asked if I wanted to go out sometime, which I replied, "No, I'm dating Ayez, and I really like him." He then said, "Don't you know Ayez is married?" The next day, I tell him about my dream, and we both laugh. Some months pass, and our relationship ends. About a year after our breakup, I learn that Ayez did have a wife back home in Bangladesh. I have no idea who that handsome stranger was in my dream, but I suspect a guardian angel. Keep up the podcast. Sincerely, Chantel. Tonight's next listener story comes to us from Zach. Zach's story is called First and Worst Encounter. Zach says, "Hey Nick, I shared a few months ago a story of me and my friend hearing a whistle that seemingly came from nowhere. Still no update on that, but I mentioned that I would share some of my childhood encounters with the paranormal. I figured I should start with the one that started my interest in the paranormal. It is also the most extreme so far. This story is so intense for me that I've had a hard time writing this, and have never shared the full details of this story before, so thanks for giving me some place to share this story. Now, this story needs some context. This was when I was 8 or 9 years old, and at the time, I had a dream light that would put stars and shapes on my ceiling. So that night, I had gone to bed at around 10, and not long after, I saw a shadow move across my ceiling. Being freaked out, I quickly turned on the light and didn't see anything by the dream light, so I turned the light off again and tried to go to sleep. But yet again, I saw some movement. Again, I would describe it at that point as a bird. At this point, I realized that me and my family had not said prayers, so I had my dad say a prayer. Then I turned my light off and tried to sleep, thinking the shadow would be gone. How wrong I was. In fact, I think that prayer just enraged or humored it. As it continued to move across the ceiling, it was like I could hear it laughing in my head until it completely covered the ceiling. It was quick, like 1 minute it was on, and the next it was off. At this point, I sat up in bed and turned the light on and told my dad that my dream light was dead and asked him to get a night light. But I would like to take note that the dream light was still on. That night light seemed to be the only thing that got that thing to stay away. Now, some small stuff had happened before this, like a light turning on by itself, and a sound that came from my kitchen, and a giant eyeball. Not sure if this one is real myself, but you never know. But this is the one that started my interest in the paranormal. Thanks, Zach. Our next story of the night comes from Leslie. Leslie's story is called Angels. Leslie says, "Hi. I have had many unexplained paranormal experiences through my life, but this one is something very precious to me. I have only really started sharing it and seeking answers for it in recent years. It is quite lengthy, but if you do ever find the time to share it, you are more than welcome to. Side note, I am baptized. I did attend a Catholic primary school, but I do not classify myself as religious as such. I believe there are things happening we have no answers for, but I just don't know what. Therefore, I struggle to commit to a specific religion. I believe this happened around Christmas of 1990 or so, 30 years ago. The exact date I am only now trying to confirm through hospital records if they can find them. I was 5 years old. My 2 older brothers were around 8 and 13. My younger sister would have been just over 2 months old. My mom was 32. I remember being at a Christmas party here in Auckland, New Zealand. I don't remember much about the party, except that I was sitting on a chair, extremely tired, and wishing that we would go home soon. I was so happy the moment that Mom told us we were going home. The time would have been a little after midnight, if I remember correctly. Mom had an average little car, a yellow Austin Allegro. There was quite a few of us that had to fit in that car that night. So, in the car was my mother who was driving, and my 2-month-old sister was in her car seat, in the front passenger seat. We also had Mom's good friend, Letty, who was around her age, my 2 older brothers, Kavanaugh 8, and Alan 13, and myself. It's a standard 5-seater car. There was 5 of us, plus a baby in the car seat. Now, after all this information, everything else I have is just flashes in my memory, and moments that I can vividly remember to this day. I was asleep in the car, crouched on the floor as the car was full, and I didn't have a seat. Next thing I can remember is waking up to a lot of noise, and I could feel glass inside my shoes. From what we know, as we were driving under the Grafton Bridge in Auckland, a bridge that is overhead of the motorway we took heading home. Somehow, a brick was either thrown or fell from the bridge and hit our car. The brick that hit our car went right through the front windscreen and hit my mother in the face. To this day, I am so grateful that it didn't hit my sister, as I don't think that a 2-month-old could have recovered from something like that. The first thing that happens that makes me think that there's something paranormal going on here is the fact that my mother had just been hit in the face by a brick whilst driving 100 kilometers per hour. Yet somehow, she managed to slow the car down and put it in park on the side of the motorway, instead of just losing control, as you would, I can only assume, and possibly have the car going 100 kilometers into another car, or the side walls or barrier. When the car was stopped and my brother managed to look around, he has noted that my mother looked unconscious in her driver's seat, and there was blood all over her face. I remember my mom's friend, my brothers, and I all got out of the car and were standing there on the side of the motorway. I believe my mom's friend was trying her hardest to flag down a car to help us. Kavanaugh, who was 8, was crying, and Alan, who was 13, was trying to get him to settle down. I don't remember being upset at that stage or scared. I just kind of felt nothing. But I do remember seeing quite a few cars out, driving past, and I remembered wondering to myself, why was no one stopping to help us? The next thing that I recall when I was thinking about this event is seeing a white car, a Mini to be exact, and it pulled over and stopped. Here's where things are just flashes or images stored in my mind. I guess you could say it's kind of like when you dream. You can't really recall every moment, but you have those certain parts that are clear as anything when you first wake up. After the memory of seeing this car, I do not have any recollection of getting in the car, or being told anything. There's just nothing I can recall. So, in the car, I don't remember driving. It didn't even feel like we were moving. All I can remember is being surrounded by bright white light. It felt as if there was nothing to the left or right of me, but I also didn't look. I wasn't looking for my brothers or sister or mother. I was just seated and staring straight ahead. Ahead of me I see 3 females. If I were to guess, it looked like a mother, an older daughter, and a younger daughter. They were all dressed in white, and they had long, beautiful brown hair. When I try to think of my time in the car, all I can see is their faces, looking into the back at me, smiling. It sounds creepier than it actually was. I don't remember them talking, but I just felt so safe. It was an indescribable feeling. I do remember hearing the words, "Everything is going to be all right." But as I said, I can't remember seeing them talk. I can't recall how long the ride was or anything, but it felt like they were watching me the whole time. Now, throughout the last 30 years, I have thought about this a lot, and this detail I just can't get my head around. They had a Mini, a 5-seater car at best, but somehow we all got to the hospital via that Mini. The 3 of them, my mother who was unconscious, a car seat with a baby, me, my 2 brothers, and Letty, my mom's friend. 9 people in a Mini. I just can't even think of an explanation. The next thing I remember is being at the hospital, not being dropped off or getting out of the car, just being inside the hospital. I remember Mom was in her hospital bed, and she had to wear a mask over her face. As I've reached a point where I just wanted answers on my experience, I asked my mother if she could just tell me anything and everything she has when it comes to this. She recalls when she came to in her hospital bed and saw a nurse. She asked where her kids were, and then asked who helped us get there. She told me that the nurse said they did see a mother and 2 daughters with us, and they were dressed in angel costumes, with the wings and all, and no one thought anything of it, as it was Christmas time. They did ask for a name and a contact number, but the nurse said they really wouldn't speak to them at all, and left promptly. After Mom was allowed to go home, we did try to find the women in the Mini that helped us out that night, even asking to broadcast something on the radio, but no one ever came forward. I've seen Letty, Mom's friend, once or twice since the accident. Sadly, people believe that she lost her mind a little after this incident. I believe that her experience resembles mine, and she was telling everyone what she had seen. As a grown woman, if she experienced what I did, I think it would be quite life-changing or traumatizing. She believes they were angels that had saved us, but no one actually took her seriously. I think it really took a toll on her, and she did end up with mental health issues, from what I was told. She has now passed a few years ago. The one time I definitely remember seeing Letty would have been maybe 15 to 20 years after the accident. Me and my mother were walking through a mall, and we bumped into her. Mom said hi. I didn't even recognize her at first. I hadn't even said anything to her yet, but she turned to me with this look on her face that I've not seen in my life. A look of total despair and need, and all she said to me was, "You remember that night, don't you? You remember the angels? You remember, right?" That's all she said to me. My heart broke for her. Although I was a little uncomfortable, I tried my best to assure her, yes, I remember them. Mom eventually told me that when I was a lot older that she believes that black magic caused this incident. My grandmother practiced black magic and taught my mother a verse that she could say if she ever felt like she was in serious danger and needed protection, but she also warned her that there would be consequences if she did use it. Mom told me about one night at home when we were all quite young. I think that night she thought there was someone in the house. I do remember a night where I woke up to the sound of men speaking and dogs. She had called the police, and they had dogs going through the house. She hadn't told me much about that night, but she did tell me that she had used the verse that her mother had given her. I believe the accident was her consequence. That brick falling and hitting her in the mouth was her punishment for using the spell, as she lost all her teeth in that accident. And I personally believe we were caught up in a battle between good and evil. She took her punishment for using the verse, but we were blessed to have angels intervene and make sure that the accident wasn't as bad as it could have been. So whatever happened that night, whether there is an explanation somewhere or not, I guess we will actually never know, but I am so grateful for having this experience in my lifetime. I have recently tried to connect with our angels, and that too has been a very eye-opening experience. So, I will keep believing that these angels are watching over me and my family, and are always there, if and when we need it most. Our next story comes to us from Grant. Grant's story is called Hearing Bigfoot. Grant says, I don't have many so-called paranormal encounters, but this is one that I will never forget. I will tell you this before telling my story, that I live in a neighborhood in Georgia, not near any cities, but also not in the middle of nowhere. I'm 17 now, and about 4 years ago, I was very into Bigfoot. From shows to YouTube videos, I loved to learn about people's encounters with Bigfoot. I would often walk around in the woods behind my house and do howls and knocks trying to get a Bigfoot interaction. I was mostly joking when doing this, as I was with some of my brothers most of the time. However, one fall night we were having a bonfire behind my house in the fire pit, and 3 of my brothers and my sister were sitting around it. I started to jokingly howl, and some of my brothers joined in. Soon after, my older brother Zach said let's go into the woods and do some howls and knocks and look for Bigfoot. My older brother Zach did not believe in Bigfoot, and doesn't to this day, so this was more or less a joke to him. I agreed, and we walked into the woods about 100 yards. We began to do a couple of howls, and we waited to hear a response. About a minute or so later, we decided to walk a bit deeper. Then, out of nowhere, on the hill above us, we heard a loud and deep howl. It felt as if the howl went through my body and shocked the inside of me. My eyes instantly began to tear up, and I tried to sprint back to the house. My brother quickly grabbed me and told me to shut up. I told him that I wanted to go back to the house. He agreed, after waiting another minute for more sounds, and we ran back to the house, where the rest of my brothers and sister were still at the fire. They saw that we were shaken up, and I was crying, and asked what had happened, and we told them. My brother would never say that what we heard was a Bigfoot, but he would say that he doesn't know what he heard that night. Our family grew up in the woods, and we were pretty well versed in the animals in our area. However, We couldn't find an explanation for that howl. Thank you for listening to my story, and I love the podcast. Grant. Tonight's next listener story comes to us from Noelle. Noelle's story is called My Experience with a Tall Shadow Entity. Noelle says, Hello, Nick. Thank you for providing a space to share our stories and find some type of understanding from similar listener experiences. I have been listening to your podcast for a while now, and I want to share something that happened to me more than a decade ago. I haven't told many people besides my family, but after listening to so many similar stories from other listeners, I feel I am not alone. Even though I have experienced many strange things I can't explain from childhood, this one has been by far the most frightening one I've experienced. This took place in the summer of 2006, when I was 18, living in Southern California. I was going to sleep one summer night, and it was not long until I slipped into a relaxed state. Almost instantly, I realized something was off. Suddenly, I heard a peculiar sound, which I couldn't pinpoint if it was from outside the apartment or inside. It kept getting louder and louder, and as it did, I began to recognize a pattern. It sounded like a mechanical screeching or buzzing, which intermittently had a loud clunk and then kept going, almost like a chainsaw, but in an electronic manner, with abrupt stops, which seemed really odd. It wasn't likely a chainsaw, since it was so late at night in a residential area. As it got louder and louder, I began to panic. I couldn't move, and the sound now began to feel like it passed a membrane and penetrated my mind. The sound then became so loud that my ears felt like they were ringing. It wasn't sounding like a mechanical sound anymore. It felt like a pulse. The sound then vanishes, and I am able to open my eyes. To my right is the wall, and I am able to make out the shadows of the tree from outside the window. Except, the shadows are not the leaves from the tree. They begin to move. I see what I had thought to be shadows take the form of small humanoid shapes. There must have been a dozen of these things on my wall, moving as shadows, in a two-dimensional form. I can only describe them as looking like small gnome or pixie representations, about 3 inches in height. They moved and pranced around on the wall in an almost menacing way, silently, as if gathering to see something about to take place, and I was at the center of it. This made me begin to freak out even more. I struggled to move my eyes to the left, and there, standing at what must have been 9 feet tall, was a dark humanoid mass right beside me. It was darker than the shadows in the room. This being seemed to be pitch black and reflecting no light coming from the window. It was almost too difficult to look at. And even though I could not make out any facial features or anything on its body, I could tell that it was looking straight at me from above. I, at this point, was beginning to scream internally and forcing myself to break out of this paralysis with all of my will. But if it couldn't get any worse, I then sensed something else in the room. I hear a voice. It came from right beside the tall figure and materialized right near my bed. I could vaguely make out that it was a woman, and she was in her late 50s. She had fair skin, and her hair was tied back but disheveled. She kneels down and begins to weep. This is, of course, freaking me out to the point that I just want to run out of there. What threw me off was that she began to describe to me that her husband is dying, and that she wants me to go and help him. She then reveals to me an address of where I can find him, and that it is urgent, but it is difficult to recall because she is weeping and talking simultaneously. She then disappears, and all I hear is the faint weeping, fading away. The tall being is still there, and I am in so much fear I can't even think of anything else but shaking myself out of this paralysis and running out of the room. I begin to focus all of my willpower, and that's when I begin to feel that if I don't get out of this situation, that I will die. I have never felt so much dread and sense of despair in my life like I did that night. It felt like this being was a void where I could not remotely feel any sense of love or happiness. I then begin to feel an electric current all over my body, and it felt like the tall being initiated it. What scared me the most was not that I would be physically harmed, but that this thing was going to destroy my mind, my memories, or my essence. I don't know how I managed to focus my mind into moving my body, but I started to move my hands, then my arms, then my legs, until I managed to step out of that space, and I jumped out of the bed and ran into the living room. After a few minutes, I gathered my thoughts and went back to my room. There was nothing there that signaled anything ever being there, but the presence was still palpable, and I felt afraid of going back to bed, let alone to sleep. I never recalled the address that woman gave me, but I'll never forget the fear that tall shadow being made me experience. I would not wish that kind of fear upon anyone. It has been many years since that night, and I can still remember it clearly. Intellectually, I entertain it, but I do not engage it much emotionally, because it feels like doing so acts like sending out a bait into the deep, and I do not want to hook anything on the line. Best regards, Noel. Our next story of the night comes from Abigail. Abigail's story is called Cabin in the Woods. Abigail says, "Hi, Nick. I have a story for you from the point of view of my grandpa. He's a Baptist preacher from the South, and he takes his convictions pretty seriously. We took a vacation to Mount Rushmore when I was about 6 or 7, and this is what I remember. We showed up to the site where our cabin was located around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was so beautiful there, and my siblings and I couldn't wait to explore. We walk into the main cabin to check in and get our keys. My dad told us to go play. There were toys and such scattered around this huge main building, but I wanted to stay with him. When my dad goes up to the counter for the keys, the manager informs him that a guest in the cabin he had reserved hasn't yet left, but he has an extra one for half price for the inconvenience. My dad said that was fine, and to show him the way. Another worker shows us out and hops into a golf cart, seemingly really uncomfortable. After about a 20-minute drive, we arrive at the cabin. It's big and looks very nice. The worker approached my dad with the keys and asked him, 'Now, I'm supposed to help you with your luggage, but there's some bad juju in that place, and I refuse to go inside anymore. Would you mind if I skipped that part?' My dad just laughed it off and gave him a friendly slap on the back. We didn't think anything more about it until a few days later. There were 8 of us there. My parents, my older sister, me, my younger sister, my younger brother, and my grandparents. Everyone went to the store to get more supplies while my mom, my grandpa, my baby brother, and I stayed behind. I was in the living room playing with my brother, who was a few months old at the time, while my mom cleaned and my grandpa napped. All of a sudden, we hear my grandpa yelling, 'Hey, you, get out of here! Leave that alone! Stop it!' I look up, and I see my mother running to his closed bedroom door. She was yanking on the door, trying to get it open. After my grandpa screamed, the door came free, and she ran inside to see what had happened. He told her that he woke up out of a dead sleep to see a woman in a nurse's outfit going through the top drawer of his dresser. He always kept his wallet and other personal items in the top drawer. He started to yell at her to leave his things alone. She looked up at him, and she had no eyes. Her eyes were black pits. He screamed, and she calmly bent down and crawled under the bed. My mom checked the whole room, and there was no one there, but the drawer was open and looked to have been rifled through. My grandpa is very spiritual and a very serious man. As I said, he's a Baptist preacher in southern Texas. Need I say anything else? After this, we came home to all our cereal boxes in the front yard, with no sign of anything else missing in the cabin, and we came home to all the faucets running as well another time. Sorry that this is a long jumbled mess, but there was a lot that happened on this trip. I have a plethora of stories that I would love to share, if you're interested. Thanks for taking the time to read my story, and God bless. Our final story of the night comes to us from Hudson. Hudson's story is called, It Called My Name. Hudson says, "When I joined the Army, I went through basic training like everyone else. We had CQ, which means charge of quarters, which is basically a nanny shift, to make sure nobody does anything stupid in the wee hours of the late night and early morning. Our building was over a sort of makeshift car park, so everything was up a level, and we were in a nice secluded spot that didn't have a lot of traffic during the day, and zero traffic at night. I had CQ on about week 2, and it was just an hour since we were in basic training. It was cold, and we had to sit outside and do nothing for an hour, probably about 11 to 12 at night. My bunkmate is dozing off next to me, and I'm trying to write a letter home or something just to stay awake. This odd howling, trilling sound starts somewhere off behind the tree line that our building butts up against. I grew up in the country, and it sounded a lot like coyotes, but something was weird about it. The noise just sounded off, and I almost thought there were people over there until it started getting closer and louder, and it became clear that it was more than a few animals, and more like a whole unseen herd. My bunkmate woke up long enough to shrug and go back to sleep. Eventually my shift ends, and our replacements arrive and send us upstairs to bed. Somehow my memory gets fuzzy here, like something is missing. I should have seen my bunkmate, or the fire guard, but somehow everyone is in bed and I'm alone. I'm walking to my bunk, which is a little less than halfway down the row, and in the dark at the back of the bay, I see a white, blue streak pass from behind one of the support pillars in the middle of the large room. I'm immediately weirded out, but not about to miss sleep, so I muster my courage and get into bed, turning my back to the back of the bay and facing the fire guard desk. I'm about to start getting comfy when I hear a powerful hissing voice carrying across 8 rows of bunks and out of the dark. It calls me by my first name, with this long drawn-out whisper that couldn't have come from a person. I know it's routine for guys and drill sergeants to mess with each other, but this was early in the cycle, and no one knew first names yet. We still only knew last names, and there was no way for our drills to sneak into our bays. I have this ridiculous chill that climbs up my spine, and in my mind I can picture some horrifying thing watching me from over the rows of darkened bunks. I'm a fairly spiritual person, and I believe in guiding spirits that I have had encounters with. I summoned the image of a particular spirit that has been with me for years, and then in my head I spoke to the creepy voice. I said, "Whatever you are, wherever you come from, you've got nothing on the one that protects me. So go ahead and take your best shot, but know that whatever gets thrown at me will come back 10 times on you." Then I closed my eyes, and a sense of peace fell over me. I slept like a baby. Throughout the cycle, others in my bay reported equally disturbing sightings with little prompting, all the way to seeing a strange face with no features. But I never had any more problems. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in and supporting the podcast, and a special thank you goes out to Aaron, Benjamin, Jay, Nick, Scotty, Bridget, Chantel, Zach, Leslie, Grant, Noel, Abigail, and Hudson for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday with our next episode. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you so much for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.